All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking over 300 years of absolutely intense, world-shifting history. We're going to explore exactly how the Americas were conquered by European superpowers, and then dive into the big question: why did Latin America violently fracture into multiple separate nations instead of uniting into one massive powerhouse? Here's our historical roadmap for today. We'll be hitting 1. The scramble for the West, 2. Conquest and hierarchy, 3. The spark of rebellion, 4. The impossible liberations, and finally, 5. The great fragmentation. Let's get into it.
Section 1. The scramble for the West. To really grasp the massive shifts that shaped the Americas, we've got to look at the economic catalysts that pushed European explorers across the Atlantic in the first place.
You know, a rapid chain of events in the 15th century literally flipped the globe upside down. For centuries, Europe relied heavily on the Silk Road for trade with the East, right? But then, in 1453, the Ottoman Empire takes control of Constantinople, totally blocking the western end of that route and slapping on massive taxes. Europe desperately needed a new path. This sheer economic pressure sparked a frantic race west. Columbus lands in the Bahamas in 1492, and suddenly Spain and Portugal are just scrambling to carve up this new world, which leads to Cabral landing in Brazil by 1500.
But here's the thing. To stop an absolute bloodbath between these two naval heavyweights, a higher authority had to step in. So, in 1494, Pope Alexander VI literally just drew an imaginary line down the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, about 2,000 kilometers west of the Cape Verde Islands. The deal was super simple. Pretty much everything west of the line went to Spain, and everything east was fair game for Portugal. Honestly, that single stroke of a pen basically dictated the cultural future of the whole continent, creating the stark divide we still see today between Portuguese-speaking Brazil and the Spanish-speaking nations.
Moving on to Section 2, Conquest and Hierarchy. What's truly wild about this next era is how a distant empire managed to maintain a brutal, unyielding grip over a landmass bigger than Europe for 3 entire centuries. 240,000. That is the staggering estimate of Aztec soldiers lost by 1521. The Spanish, led by Hernán Cortés, showed up with steel swords, guns, and horses. But their most devastating weapon wasn't even intentional. It was disease. Smallpox absolutely decimated the native tribes who had zero immunity to it. Out of those 240,000 fallen soldiers, it's estimated that more than half were killed, not by the sword, but by sickness. That's really how the Spanish managed to overwhelm mighty empires like the Aztecs, and later on the Incas.
Now, amidst all this brutal conquest and resource grabbing, there was actually a rare bit of pushback from within the church. After reading letters from missionaries who were actually living among the indigenous people, Pope Paul III issued a moral directive. He stated that the native people were not beasts to be killed or enslaved, but human beings with souls capable of salvation. It was a pretty significant, albeit limited, warning to colonists during an era that was otherwise defined by total subjugation.
So the absolutely crucial takeaway here is this insanely unfair social hierarchy Spain used to keep control. It was maddeningly rigid. Think about it. If you were a peninsulare, meaning you were born in Spain and sailed over, you got handed all the top government and military jobs. But if you were a Creole, meaning you had Spanish blood but happened to be born in the Americas, you were completely treated as a second-class citizen. You could literally own half the countryside and be wildly wealthy, but a fresh-off-the-boat peninsulare would always outrank you. This systemic disrespect allowed intense anger to just boil among the Creoles, decade after decade, planting the seeds for class divisions that still echo in Latin America today. Section 3. The Spark of Rebellion. Let's fast forward to the 19th century and see how this all blows up. Because, ironically, it was a totally unrelated conflict over in Europe that accidentally ignited the fight for Latin American independence. Okay, so in 1808, Napoleon Bonaparte is aggressively expanding his French empire, and he actually manages to imprison the King of Spain. For the furious Creoles over in the Americas, this was the ultimate excuse. They started forming these local councils called juntas, and it was a genius political maneuver, really. They cleverly claimed, oh, we're just governing ourselves in the name of the kidnapped king, just holding down the fort until he gets back. But in reality, they were tasting real power for the very first time. But honestly, this early independence phase was just incredibly chaotic. It was kind of like a terrible group project where everyone hates each other. Almost immediately, these brand new governments start fighting. Buenos Aires actually sends an army to invade neighboring Paraguay just to force them into their government. Up north, a massive earthquake destroys Caracas in 1812, and Spanish loyalist priests start shouting that it's God's wrath for the rebellion. Terrified revolutionaries just start deserting. By 1815, Napoleon is defeated. The Spanish king is free, and he sends warships straight to the Americas. The revolution looked completely dead in the water.
Which brings us to Section 4. The impossible liberations. With the fires of revolution basically snuffed out by the Spanish, two completely different men on opposite sides of the continent decided to try the exact same impossible military strategy. 10,000 feet up. That is the freezing, deadly altitude of the Andes Mountains. To bypass the Spanish army, an Argentine general named José de San Martin dragged 5,000 soldiers, mules, and incredibly heavy cannons across these frozen, suffocating mountain passes. It was considered absolute suicide, which is of course exactly why the Spanish never saw it coming. San Martin's forces came crashing down into Chile, completely blindsiding and defeating the Spanish army. Now, while San Martin is liberating the south, you've got Simon Bolivar, this wealthy, flashy Venezuelan leader, pulling off his own mountain crossing miracle in the north. And these two guys were total opposites. San Martin was quiet, practical, and preferred collaboration. Bolivar was this grand visionary who wanted to personally stitch the whole continent into one massive supercountry. So when these two finally meet up behind closed doors in Ecuador, they clash hard. San Martin actually walked out of that room, handed over his armies to Bolivar, and quietly left South America forever. So with San Martin gone, Bolivar just goes for it. He wasn't satisfied with simply kicking the Spanish out. He forcefully merged Venezuela, Colombia, and Ecuador into one gigantic supernation called Gran Colombia. But there was a huge problem. He decided to govern this entire colossal territory from Bogota, Colombia. The other regions were immediately furious. I mean, they didn't just fight a bloody war against a distant ruler in Spain only to be bossed around by a distant ruler in Bogota. That exact tension between centralized control and local autonomy is a struggle that still defines much of the region today.
And that brings us to the climax. Section 5, the great fragmentation. We finally have to answer the ultimate question. Why did this enormously wealthy, newly liberated landmass violently shatter into pieces instead of uniting like the United States?
Okay, before we watch Spanish America completely break apart, we have to talk about Brazil, because they were the wild exception to all this chaos. When Napoleon invaded Portugal, the Portuguese royal family did something the Spanish didn't. They ran. They literally packed up the entire royal court and sailed to Rio de Janeiro. So the young prince, Dom Pedro, grew up Brazilian.
When Portugal eventually demanded he come back across the ocean, he refused, famously shouting, "Independence or death!" Because Brazil had this beloved royal figurehead who actually stayed, their independence held together as one massive, unified nation. But Spanish America? They had no prince. They just had empty thrones. And nature absolutely abhors a vacuum. Into that emptiness stepped the caudillos. These were tough, ruthless military strongmen, warlords basically, who looked at their local armies and declared, "Yep, I'm in charge now." People like Juan Manuel de Rosas in Argentina ruled by pure force and intimidation, and they had zero intention of sharing power with some continental government. These caudillos left a devastating legacy of localized dictatorships that haunted the region's stability for generations. So why couldn't they hold it together? Well, it was a compounding nightmare of factors. You had the stubborn caudillos refusing to cooperate, sure, but you also had active foreign interference. The British actually wanted Latin America divided to make the nations easier to push around, so they signed separate deals to keep neighbors jealous and rivalries hot. And then there was the sheer brutal reality of the geography itself. I mean, let's put that geographic hurdle into perspective. In the era before telegraphs or railways, it could take a staggering 3 months, 90 days, just for a single letter to travel from South America to Spain. The continent is dominated by the impassable Andes, thousands of miles of scorching deserts, and the Amazon rainforest, which is basically an ocean of dense jungle the size of Western Europe. Merely communicating across these distances to run a unified government, it was physically impossible. Under all this immense pressure, the whole dream rapidly unraveled. In a desperate final attempt to hold Gran Colombia together, Bolivar made a fatal error. He declared himself dictator. That was the last straw. The very people who just bled to overthrow a king immediately rebelled. Venezuela and Ecuador broke away. Further north, the Federal Republic of Central America shattered into 5 separate nations. By 1831, Bolivar's grand masterpiece had completely disintegrated.
So by 1830, Simon Bolivar is broke. He's dying of a lung disease and is watching his lifelong dream turn to absolute ash. He reportedly said this incredibly tragic thing: "He who serves a revolution plows the sea." He finally realized that trying to force unity onto this vast, untamable, deeply divided continent was just as futile as trying to plow the ocean waves.
Fast forward to today. Think about this. There are roughly 400 million people across Latin America who share the exact same language, the same dominant religion, and over 300 years of shared historical struggle. Honestly, they arguably have way more in common than the original 13 American colonies ever did, and yet they remain rigidly separated by borders that were drawn in blood and chaos way back in the 1830s. So, I'm going to leave you with this one final fascinating thought to ponder. We've seen how the brutal mountains, the stubborn warlords, and calculating foreign empires all conspire to keep a continent fractured. But what if they hadn't? If Bolivar's grand dream had somehow survived the Andes and the caudillos, if a unified, massive superstate stretching all the way from Mexico down to Argentina existed right now, how drastically different would the entire economic and political balance of power in our modern world be?